Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is Tammy. Thank you for joining us tonight. I want to go ahead and get started by welcoming our guest speaker, Billy Dettlaff. Thank you, Billy.
Hello, Tammy, and thank you. I just lost my screen.
That's okay. You could introduce yourself and then you can share it.
Great. Well, again, everybody, good evening. My name is Billy Dettlaff, and I am a PGA Master Professional number 57. This year will be my 40th year as a PGA of America member. And I have some South Florida ties, although I was born and raised in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, back in the 1950s and 1960s. And I was lucky enough to be offered early retirement in 2009, and that allowed me to fulfill a long-term desire to write a book on the history of golf. And it took me 6 years. I wrote about 450,000 words. And it ended up being a 697-page book on the history of the golf profession, stretching from the 1400s to modern day. I was lucky enough to have part of that book used for the PGA Centennial book. So I'm also the author of the PGA Centennial book that was brought out in 2016, 4 years ago. So I'm excited today. Tammy and I discussed keeping it a little more narrow for this first presentation. And this is a presentation that I do for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And I've given to a number of other groups and organizations. And it's a history of golf in Florida that I think you'll find interesting. I do it with a PowerPoint, and it will be about 80 slides. So
Well, we're not gonna hold you to 80. You know, whatever you like. We're not gonna count. So all you have to do, Billy, is click on the green button to share your screen, and then find that slide, and then the blue button.
I'm not seeing the
share button.
Yeah.
Yep. Just take your mouse and put it towards the bottom of your screen, and it'll pop up in front of you.
Are you there?
Yep.
Okay. I've completely lost the screen.
Lost what? That's okay. So click on your share screen. You see this, the green share screen?
Oh, there it is. It just popped. I couldn't get it up for a minute.
Yeah,
ago.
it's a hidden toolbar. That's okay.
Yeah. All right.
We'll have to talk to Zoom and get that, have it permanent.
Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can.
Good to go. Great. Well, there we go. All right. So this evening, we're going to talk about the history of golf in Florida. And the history of golf in Florida is really based upon resorts and tourism. And that's where it got its start. And not much has changed in the past 130 years of golf in Florida. The first person to play golf in Florida was John Hamilton Gillespie. And Mr. Gillespie arrived in Sarasota, Florida in 1886, and he brought his golf clubs with him. He was a young man growing up in Edinburgh, Scotland, and his father worked for a land company that purchased 50,000 acres of land that we all know today as Sarasota, Florida. When he got here, it was pretty rough, pretty much of a pioneer. And he missed his golf, and he knew he had his golf clubs. So he built a 2-hole golf course, which now today, if you drive down Main Street in Sarasota, you're probably playing over parts of his golf course. He expanded that golf course to 9 holes in 1902. And as development was coming to Florida, a gentleman by the name of Henry Plant saw a value in golf for his resort hotels that he was building. And he started working with Mr. Gillespie. And unfortunately, Mr. Gillespie died in 1923 in Sarasota, Florida. And he was a member of the R&A in St. Andrews. But golf in Florida is really needs to be credited to two gentlemen. I call it the tale of two Henrys. Henry B. Plant, who had the Plant system, and Henry P. Flagler, who built the Florida East Coast railroads. Mr. Plant was a post-Civil War railroad tycoon. He was a Northerner who saw the value in coming south in buying up all the little railroads in the Southeast United States, and he put them together, and his railroads really dominated the Southeast of the United States. He had a new railroad that he expanded from Waycross, Georgia to Jacksonville, Florida in the late 1880s. And then he opened a central hub that went down to Orlando and on over to the Tampa area from Jacksonville. And that was known as his Tampa hub. He built a number of major tourist hotels up and down the coast. In addition, he also owned ships. And he built a golf course in Cuba that was included as part of his collection of golf courses. In the Tampa area in 1895, his first golf course was opened, and it was known as Bel Air Country Club. By 1897, it had 6 holes of golf, but the putting was done over crushed seashells. There was no grass on the greens in that era. By 1916, his empire was growing, the hotel was becoming more popular, and he hired Donald Ross to come down and to build a new golf course for him at that time. And through that relationship with Gillespie, he designed golf courses in Winter Park, Florida, Tampa, Bel Air, and as I mentioned, Havana, Cuba. This is the famous Bellevue Hotel. And you can see that the railroad literally came to the front door of the hotel and brought East Coast residents down for the winter months from New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., down through Jacksonville, into Orlando, and eventually over to the Tampa area and beyond. Bel Air Country Club was a very well-known club that was associated with the hotel in Clearwater, Florida. That was a new Donald Ross design. They converted the sand greens to turf greens, and he hired a famous gentleman by the name of Alex Smith as the head golf professional. Now, Alex Smith was one of the Smith brothers. And if any of you have ever played golf in Scotland, you probably played some golf in Carnoustie, Scotland. And the Smith brothers were born and raised on the Carnoustie golf course. He created these golf courses as major winter competitive golf courses. And the club and the hotel was recently renovated in just the past year or two. This was the grounds of the Bellevue Hotel. To me, it's almost like a Disney World look, but this was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s with the canal moving through. If you look closely over on the right side of that photograph, if you can see it clearly enough, there are horses and carriages coming up and down along that waterway. And this is the beautiful restored Bellevue Inn from 2019, just a few years ago. They reduced the hotel, which was once over 1,000 rooms, down to this smaller boutique type hotel that is getting rave reviews. Now, Henry Flagler was a competitor. And Flagler's golf course is on what is known as Florida's first coast of golf. And Flagler made his money back in the 1800s. He was a partner of John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil business. But in 1885, his wife was suffering some illnesses, and it was suggested that the Florida weather might be good for him. So he and his wife moved to St. Augustine, Florida, and that was the beginning of the resort and tourism in St. Augustine. Now, this is the Hotel Ponce de Leon and the golf links. And if you look at this postcard from the turn of the century, today, this same building is Flagler College. And if you ever find your way up to St. Augustine, you can actually get tours of what was once this beautiful hotel. It's been fully renovated. The Flagler College takes very good care of it. This is looking from the front steps of that hotel across the street to the Hotel Alcazar. Now, the Alcazar was a step down from the original hotel, and a lot of the golf professionals that came down to play in the various tournaments in St. Augustine stayed at that hotel because it was a less expensive option. The first St. Augustine golf course was called Fort Greene. It was built in 1895, and it consisted of 3 golf holes. Basically, you had to play 3 times around that golf course in order to get a 9-hole score, and the total 9-hole length was about 1,900 yards. So it was a very short golf course, and it was built just around the corner on the Fort Marion property, which was about 2 blocks from the hotel. And they had 3 holes, and they were named the San Marco, Fort Marion, and the Palmetto. And at the time, the turn of the century, the club had over 200 members, of which 70 of them were women. And they paid a membership fee of 50 cents. And you had to be, just like many modern day golf courses, sponsored by a member. Alex Findlay was hired by Mr. Flagler to become the game of golf's first director of golf. And now he was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, and he arrived in the United States in 1886. He first went out west to Oklahoma to visit a friend there, and he brought his golf clubs along at that same time, only to find out that there weren't golf courses in Oklahoma in the 1880s. So he built a little golf course there. But he was hired by a company by the name of Wright and Ditson. And if you have or seen any old Hickory golf clubs, you might have seen some Wright and Ditson golf clubs. If you've seen the movie The Greatest Game Ever Played about the 1913 US Open, you would see that they play a very prominent role in that movie. Now, he was hired by Henry Flagler in 1897, and he was to become the director of golf for all of the Florida East Coast Railway golf courses. He also designed the golf courses and organized the tournaments, and then hired the golf professionals to not only come and run those golf courses, but also play in tournaments. And the whole idea was the more golf tournaments that you could run and the more golf professionals you could get to come down to Florida during the winter months, the more opportunity you would have to get stories in the metropolitan newspapers like the New York Times and the Boston Herald, all up and down the east coast of Florida. Now, this was the pamphlet, picture of a centerfold of the pamphlet from 1901 of what was called the Flagler's Collection of Golf Courses. And you'll see there, women golfers were very prominent, even at the turn of the century. And the first golf course, as you came into Florida, was the Links of St. Augustine. And then you moved your way down on his railroad down to Ormond Beach, which is just north of today's Daytona Beach. Then his next golf course, you came all the way down to Palm Beach for the Links of Palm Beach. And if you look closely, if you can see that on your screens, at the bottom is the Breakers Hotel, and up at the top is the Royal Ponciana Hotel. And the 18 holes of golf were played back and forth between those areas. Then the next golf course was the Links of Miami. And he also had a golf course in Nassau in the Bahamas. that was the links of Nassau. And then again, he also had ships and boats that went over to the Bahamas for his tourism. This is an illustration out of a 1914 ad from Golf Illustrated magazine that was promoting the winter golf in Florida. And if you notice some of the type in here, if you're lucky enough to be able to read some of this on your screens, the golf season in Florida really didn't start until after January 1st and ended in April. So most people came to Florida for a vacation during those 4 months, and then Florida was rather desolate for the rest of the year. This is the layout of the 9-hole Links of St. Augustine golf course. And if you look at the names on that scorecard, it's Maria, Sanchez, the Cedars, Fiddler Crab, Tower Drive, St. Sebastian. And then you get down to number 6, and it's Lang Struct. And that is actually a street in Scotland. And then the rest of the names continue on with Spanish names, Cordova, Alcazar, and Ponce de Leon. Now, if you've ever been to St. Augustine, you probably have seen, this is a national monument. It's run by the National Park Service. This is the Castillo San Marcos National Monument, and it was the first Spanish fort built in the United States, with St. Augustine being the oldest city in the United States. Now, I want you to take a close look at this photograph here, because I want to show you, I took this picture about 2 years ago, and I want you to keep this in mind as we go to the next page and see if you see a familiarity there. There's the castle 125 years ago on a postcard from, I think, 1901. And the golf tee and the golf course played around that fort in St. Augustine. And you can see all the various ladies and men in their golf attire of turn of the century golf. Now, again, publicity was very important to Henry Flagler to get people to read about Florida golf and to bring those Northerners down to Florida. So in February of 1900, a match was put together between the famous Harry Vardon, who was the 1899 Open champion, the British Open champion. Harry Vardon was an Englishman and has won 6 British Opens, more than any other man. And on the right side is Willie Smith. And he's the younger brother of the earlier Smith that we talked about. And he was the 1899 US Open. So in February of 1900, the most famous early match in all of golf took place in St. Augustine, when the 2 champions, the champions of Great Britain and the champion of America, met in a match, and they played 36 holes in one day, which was very typical back then for the matches. And Harry Vardon ended up beating Willie Smith by a score, I think it was 4-3. In 1916, the Flagler Company hired Donald Ross to come down and build a golf course north of the city. And this was the first 18-hole golf course in St. Augustine. This is a picture of the old clubhouse. Unfortunately, the golf course was closed about 10 years ago. It became a municipal golf course, and the city sold the land off to become a housing development. But one of the famous things that took place in 1921, just 5 years after the golf course was built, is Gene Sarazen. Many of you know the name of Gene Sarazen. Gene Sarazen was playing golf at the St. Augustine golf course, and he ran into the gentleman on the far left side of this photograph, who is holding the 1921 US Open trophy, and his name was Long Jim Barnes. And Sarazen says to Barnes, what are you doing? Do you have a match today? He said, no, I don't. He said, well, the big guy's here. And he says, what do you mean the big guy? The big guy is here. And the big guy is the second gentleman from the left in this photograph, happens to be Warren G. Harding, the president-elect of the United States. And the president was golfing and relaxing before he was about to take over the presidency of the United States. His inauguration was about 2 weeks away, but before that, he wanted to play some golf in Florida. Now, going across that picture from left to right, we mentioned Jim Barnes, then you have President Harding, and then in the checkered coat is a young Walter Hagen, and then there's Willie McLeod, and there's Vice President Calvin Coolidge, and then on the far right is the reigning 1921 British Open champion, Jock Hutchinson. Now, Jock Hutchinson and Willie McLeod were very good friends with Bobby Jones. And Bobby Jones asked those two gentlemen to become the very first honorary starters for the Masters tournament. And they did that together in the 1960s and early 1970s. Now, women also played a lot of golf. And the Florida East Coast Championship was played on that same 18-hole golf course in St. Augustine. This is a picture of Peggy Kirk Bell and Babe Zaharias at the Ponce de Leon Resort in St. Augustine back in 1947. As we move south, we find ourselves on the links of Ormond Beach, and the FEC stands for Florida East Coast Golf Club. And if you see, there's the layout there. And it was a 9-hole golf course that crossed a couple of the roads in that area, played back and forth. And again, it was 9 holes of golf with local names for each of the holes. Now, this is a very fancy clubhouse and the first tee of the Ormond Beach golf course. If you see that white flag flying up there, it's FEC, Florida East Coast Railway flag. And that tee box there, if you know the expression that we use today, you want to tee the ball up in the tee box. Well, it comes from that vision. Back then, they would build a tee, pack the sand and seashells to create a teeing area. And this was, again, at the Ormond Beach Golf Course. You could, another golf course, the famous Ormond Hotel, this was not a Flagler golf course, but it was very close to it. This golf course is still in existence today, and it's known as the Oceanside Country Club that was opened in 1907. And again, it's a period postcard showing how close that golf course was to the ocean. Now, if you were part of the Henry Flagler Golf Club, you could hop on a train and head south about 3 hours and end up in Palm Beach. And you could play what today is known as the Breakers Hotel. And I didn't know if you realized it, but the Breakers Hotel golf course is the oldest existing 18-hole golf course in the state of Florida. This is a picture of the first tee on a tournament day at the Breakers on the links of Palm Beach. And a couple of interesting things that I'll point out to you. Again, if you look at the tee box, it was a wooden box that was elevated. And I'm going to zoom in here. And if you look at that V-shaped trough, you might wonder what that's all about. Well, when golfers in the early days wanted to play some golf, you would go to the first tee, and they didn't necessarily have starting times. So what you would do is you'd put a golf ball at the top of that trough, and you'd let it roll down that trough, and your ball would be put in position behind anybody else who was waiting to tee off. So you might be 4 balls behind or 5 balls behind, which meant you were that number of balls in groups behind and ready to tee off. Now, just behind that trough, if you see that round bucket, and then above it, another water bucket, that round bucket was a bucket of sand, and the bucket above it was a bucket of water. And back in those days, they didn't use wooden tees. You had a little metal form that you got the sand wet, you put it into that little form, and the caddy would plop it down on top of the sand, and he'd make a little tee out of sand, and then you'd place your ball on top of the sand. And this must have been some kind of tournament day, because the young man sitting at the table looks as though he does have some paperwork and registration forms to get those people ready to play golf. Now, this is the first green. And yes, that little white round area was the first green at the Breakers in Palm Beach. And you can see that the caddy is holding up a flag stick with the number 1 on that flagpole there. Now, Palm Beach Country Club was built by the Breakers Hotel and the Flagler people in 1916. And again, here's another Donald Ross design. And the interesting thing about this is a wonderful little golf course, about 6,200 yards. It is still in existence today. Now, this lady over on the right side of the screen, her name is Bessie Fenn. And Bessie's father, Arthur Fenn, was also the golf professional at the Poland Springs Resort in Maine during the summer months. And then he'd come down, and for 26 years, he was the golf professional at the Breakers. When he passed away suddenly in the mid-1920s, Bessie, who was an outstanding amateur golfer, was chosen over 300 other golf professionals, become the official golf professional at the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. And Bessie held that position from the mid-1920s until she retired in 1963. And Bessie was a very well-known figure in Palm Beach golf. This, we believe, is the first tee at the Miami Royal Palm Hotel in Miami. Again, Henry Flagler, you could hop on Henry Flagler's train and take it down to Miami, and you'd pull in front of this beautiful hotel that overlooked Biscayne Bay. And again, this is a smaller first tee, but again, a little square box that was situated right in front of the gallery along the promenade of that front porch. So anybody who wanted to watch some golf could just come and sit on the railing and watch who was playing golf that day. Now, this next photograph is one of my favorites. This was known as a putting clock. And if you look around the outside of this circle, there are hole numbers. Now, what you did was you could putt out to the middle of this green. It was a sand green, and there was a hole in the middle. And then you could putt back to the numbers that were all the way around, and it looked like a clock. So you'd play around as if you were ticking off the time on a clock. And if you take a close look at this photograph at the little boy on the far right on the green, he's pulling a board with a rope that helped to take off the footprints when people would play on that hole. So they'd smooth it out so you could get a nice smooth putt. We're staying in Miami here for the Biltmore Hotel. The Biltmore, which still exists in Coral Gables, Florida, has 36 holes of golf, recently renovated, as well as the hotel. It's a historic building and a historic golf course in Coral Gables, and again, built in 1926. You can see the hotel is still under construction when they started to play some golf. I absolutely love this picture. And I sometimes wonder that these young boys were all caddies at the Biltmore. And Alex Smith, the gentleman I've mentioned a couple of times today, he was hired to come down to Miami to be the golf professional. And I just imagine in my mind that the smiles on their faces, I'm wondering if this might have been the first time they were ever had their photograph taken or something. But 1920s Miami, Florida. We're going to come back up north a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jacksonville and the beaches, which has a very long history in golf. And a lot of it's due again to Henry Flagler. At the turn of the century, in the year 1900, Jacksonville was Florida's largest city, and it had a population of 28,430 people. And in 1901, there was the Great Fire. It burned 148 city blocks, 2,300 buildings, including 23 churches, and 10 hotels burnt down. When you look at Jacksonville, Florida's largest city, now I've lived here for 20 years, and I never gave it a thought about Florida's largest city. How many of you realize that Jacksonville, Florida is still the largest city in Florida? By population, it's larger than Miami, it's larger than Orlando, it's larger than Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach and Tampa. And I didn't know that until just recently. It now has a population of about 903,000 people. So Henry Flagler did not build this hotel, but he ended up buying it, and it's in Atlantic Beach. It was built in Atlantic Beach, which is you could call it a suburb of Jacksonville. It's on the ocean, and it unfortunately burnt down a couple of times, and it's been lost and it has not been rebuilt. But this is a copy of the 18-hole golf course. And they also had what was called a 9-hole Lilliputian, or a lily putt golf course, which was a short golf course. And the famous architect A.W. Tillinghast built this golf course in 1916. And I don't know how familiar you all are with A.W. Tillinghast, but he was part of the golden age of golf course architecture in the United States. He was a famous early golfer. He was a famous golf writer, and he's more famous as a golf course architect. Bethpage in New York, out on Long Island, the Black Course, he had a very important role in building that golf course. But he promoted during the 1910s and 1920s the concept of miniature golf courses and building golf courses on private estates, adjoining the grounds of regular country clubs, and even on people's home lawns. And basically, that this is an ad on the left of this that promoted his work in 1915. Now, back to St. Augustine for a minute, Ripley's Bayfront Mini Golf Course is the oldest mini golf course in the United States, or rather in Florida, and it's right by the famous Bridge of Lions in downtown St. Augustine. In Jacksonville Beach, where I'm located, in Ponte Vedra Beach, there was an 18-hole golf course designed in 1927 by W.D. Clark of Chicago, and it was built by the National Lead Company on a site that was once known as Mineral City. All of the sands and the dunes along the beach in this area were mined for titanium, among other things. And they opened this area for residential development in 1928, and they named it Ponte Vedra Beach. Hopefully some of you are familiar with that. But here's the amazing thing. The National Lead Company, as they mined this area, they owned 17 miles of coastline that stretched from Jacksonville Beach all the way down to almost St. Augustine. And a lot of that land, fortunately, was purchased and bought by the state of Florida, as well as as a national park. So there's some very native coastlines along the way. But if you look at this picture at the bottom, it's the original log cabin clubhouse, and it doubled as a Red Cross station with lifeguards in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, in 1933, they decided that they wanted to have a better golf course. So they hired a gentleman by the name of Herbert Strong, who was a Long Island, New York designer, and he built the Ocean Course in 1933. And you can see the type of landscape at this time for this golf course. And this is a little closer. You can see the rolls and the hills on that putting green. And it was named, shortly after it opened, it was named one of the 4 toughest golf courses in the United States, along with Pebble Beach, Pine Valley in New Jersey, Oakmont in Pennsylvania, and the Ocean Course here. The Ocean Course in 1939, March of 1939, was awarded the 1939 Ryder Cup by the PGA of America. And this is a picture again of the golf course. And you can see the location of the golf course is literally on the ocean. There's a small road there and then the ocean. Well, today, an 80-foot wide lot sells for $3 to $4 million. And it's all built out. The golf course doesn't have the ocean views that it once had. But how many of you are familiar with the 1939 Ryder Cup? Here's the cover of PGA magazine from September 1939. And you can see there the headline is "Awaiting the Ryder Cup matches." And that's a picture of the Ponte Vedra Inn and Club golf course. Well, I'd be surprised if any of you were familiar with the 1939 Ryder Cup. And there's a good reason why. A month before, in August of 1939, World War II broke out in Europe, and the British team had to cancel playing the Ryder Cup in 1939. So the Ryder Cup never came to Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, never came to the United States because of World War II, and it wasn't played for another 8 years. They did play some other golf courses at the Ponte Vedra Country Club, which is now the Inn and Club. 1951, a very famous ladies golfer, Babe Zaharias, won that tournament here in Ponte Vedra Beach. Jacksonville hosted a tournament called the Jacksonville Open from 1945 through 1953, and then again from 1965 until 1976. The reason that tournament ended was the Tournament Players Club, and the TPC began and replaced the Jacksonville Open. But during the Jacksonville Open, Ben Hogan had his worst hole ever at Jacksonville's Hyde Park Golf Club in 1947. Ben Hogan took an 11 on a par 3, which was his worst hole ever in his career. I enjoy this picture because there's Ben, and somebody colorized Ben, which looks good, but this young lady in the back is almost a similar pose to Ben. I just think it as a photograph, I really enjoy it. One of the other golf courses that they played the Jacksonville Open on happened to have a couple of people didn't like to be bothered. That's just a picture of one of the local residents on that golf course. This was Sawgrass Country Club in the Tournament Players Championship, which we all know now as TPC, or the Players Championship, was hosted there from 1977 until 1981. And then Dean Beeman decided to move the tournament across the street, and he created the Tournament Players Club. And the first Players Championship to be played at TPC Sawgrass came here in 1982, and it is played to this day. However, this year, the tournament played the first day, and then because of the COVID worries, it was canceled for the balance of the week. It is coming back this year with reduced crowds. But this is a picture, if you can see, the guy in the pink shirt doing a swan dive into the water there was Jerry Pate, who was the first champion of the Players Championship And he said he was going to throw Dean Beeman and Pete Dye in the lake. And he did that. You see the two heads bobbing over to the right. And then he followed with a dive into the water that made the Players Championship famous from the very beginning. But this was built over a swamp. And this is what the 18th hole looked like during construction. This was the first tee. Dean Beeman had the idea of creating stadium golf. And when stadium golf was first built, it basically was a lot of sand and wood pilings, and people would sit on the sand, but they'd have kind of a gallery set up instead of bleachers. Excuse me. This is the view of the 18th hole and the original clubhouse in the background. You can see that pyramid-shaped building. And this is that same look, that same hole has changed a little bit over the 40 years. And the new clubhouse is a little bit better looking than the original pyramid. And as you know, TPC Sawgrass is famous for the world famous Island Green. But I didn't know how many of you realized that there was a famous Island Green in 1901. And it was built at Baltusrol, just in New Jersey, just outside of New York City. And there's kind of a fun story. If you look at the front of this picture, the foreground, there's people standing on the hill. Well, just down below them, there's a tee. And that tee is built into the hillside. And Walter Hagen played this golf course shortly after it was built in the 19-teens, early 1920s. And he drove his ball into the water surrounding the green. Well, back in those days, the construction of the golf ball was a little different. And many of the golf balls that were made with a cover called gutta percha floated if they went in the water. And Walter Hagen got down to find his ball actually floating in the water. So he took his shoes and socks off and he got down in the water because it was only about 2 or 3 feet deep. And he asked his caddy for a wedge and he hit that wedge and he splashed the ball out of the water up on the green and made his putt for a birdie 3 out of that famous water hole. Now, the next famous Island Green was in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, but it didn't take place until the mid-1930s. And this is a view of the ocean in the background and the Ponte Vedra Inn and Hotel. And this is their Island Green, but you can see it was surrounded by a lot more grass than this Island Green. And this is a press photograph of the original Island Green in 1980, the TPC 17th hole. And that's what it looked like when it was under construction in 1980. And this is a picture that I took 3 years ago for the 2016, 4 years ago now, for the 2016 Players Championship. And you can see that that's changed a little bit. But that's a little history for you of Island Greens in Florida. If any of you get up north in this area of the country, I want to encourage you to visit the World Golf Hall of Fame. It's in St. Augustine, right on I-95. It's an exit off of I-95, and it's a wonderful place to visit. I encourage you to do so. You can probably view it in 2 to 3 hours, but it's a great place to go and a great way to learn the history of the game of golf. Now, Florida, I don't know how many of you realize this, Florida leads the nation by states with the most golf courses in the United States. Florida, it kind of varies. We get a few new ones and then some golf courses close down, but roughly 1,250 golf courses exist in Florida today. The next closest is the state of New York with roughly 1,000. And in third place is the state of California with 950 golf courses. Now, the Florida county with the most golf courses happens to be Palm Beach County. I don't know how many of you realize that, but there's an estimated 160 golf courses in operation. And the top rated golf course in Palm Beach County happens to be Seminole Golf Club. It's in North Palm Beach. It's on the ocean. It was a Donald Ross design, another Donald Ross golf course, built in 1929. And among the famous members was the Kennedy family. And there's a picture of President Kennedy. Now, presidents like to play golf. Many of you know that Trump is famous, and some people might say infamous, for playing a lot of golf during his 4-year tenure as president of the United States. But even Richard Nixon was known to put a golf club in his hand, and that's Richard Nixon down in Miami, getting a golf lesson from Jackie Gleason. This is a picture from the 1975 Inverary Classic. It was known back then as the Jackie Gleason Inverary Classic. And I just show you this slide because we got going from left to right in this photograph is Jack Nicklaus, President Ford, Jackie Gleason, and a gentleman by the name of Elliott Kahn, and then Bob Hope. Well, they played foursomes in the Pro-Am at Inverary, but Mr. Kahn wanted to play in this group. So in 1975, he told the tournament, I want to play. And they said, well, we only have 4 people in this group. He said, I want to play. I'll pay anything. So they were charging about $1,000 to play in the Pro-Am. But in order to play in this group with Mr. Nicklaus, Mr. Hope, Mr. Ford, and Mr. Gleason, Mr. Kahn paid $10,000 in 1975. And seeing that all of that money was going to the boys clubs and the girls clubs of Fort Lauderdale, they let him play in that group that year. So that was a famous foursome for that year. Here's a picture of Mr. Gleason, again, playing with Mr. Ford. I tell people that I've had 2 lives in golf. I grew up in golf. My father was a golf professional in Wisconsin. And then I went into the newspaper business. And then I became a golf professional in 1978. And my first job in golf was at Inverary Country Club. And I spent 9 years being the golf professional of Mr. Jackie Gleason. And I used to go out and watch Mr. Gleason hit practice balls in the middle of summer, July, August, the hottest days of the year. Mr. Gleason used to drive up on the tee in his famous rolling rider. People thought it was a Rolls Royce golf cart, but it was called a rolling rider. And he would always wear a long sleeve silk shirt and hit golf balls. And Mr. Gleason was a heavy smoker. And Mr. Gleason would come out, he'd light up a cigarette, he'd pat his pack of cigarettes, light it, take 3 puffs, throw it on the ground, get out of his cart, walk around his cart, take a golf club out of his bag. He'd hit 3 or 4 golf balls. He'd go back, sit down, pat his pack of cigarettes, take another cigarette, light it up, take 3 or 4 puffs, throw it on the ground. And he'd practice for about a half an hour, or another way of saying it, he'd practice for about 8 or 10 cigarettes and about 8 or 10 golf clubs with about 3 or 4 shots each. And he'd say, thanks, pal. And he'd hop in his cart and drive away. But Mr. Gleason was a great person to be around, and he was always very kind to me. President Clinton was also played golf. That's a picture of me giving President Clinton a little golf tip while he was warming up to play his round of golf at TPC Sawgrass in 2007. Famous tournaments to be played in Florida include the 1983 Ryder Cup that was played at PGA National. And this is a picture of the victorious 1983 team. Jack Nicklaus was the captain of the team, and they squeaked out a 14.5 to 13.5 victory that year. And that was the last year of America's dominance of the Ryder Cup. Great Britain, and now what we refer to as the European team, started to win more tournaments than we've won, and they've now become the dominant force in the Ryder Cup. Other Florida majors is that Florida has hosted the PGA Championship twice, once in 1971 at PGA National Golf Club, which is known now as I believe, JDM Country Club. And then in 1987, the PGA National Resort and Spa hosted the PGA Championship as well. PGA Tour events that have been famous through Florida started back in 1962 with the Miami Doral Eastern Open, and that played up until about 3 years ago. I worked at the Inverary Classic for a number of years, which was held in Lauderhill, Florida. That started back in 1972, and that turned into the Honda Classic. And the Honda Classic, as you all probably realize, is now played at PGA National. And they'll be celebrating next year their 50th anniversary as a PGA Tour event. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but this was the cover for Gleneagles sales brochure in 1985. If you look down at the bottom right of that dark green cover, it's embossed with Gleneagles. And this was a picture that I got a call one day when I was the head golf professional at Inverary Country Club, and a company wondered if I had any old golf clubs and could they come out and shoot some pictures for a brochure to promote Gleneagles Country Club. So that bag of hickory golf clubs and those two models was taken at Inverary Country Club in 1985. Now, the two trophies in this picture were trophies that my father had during his life. He won one national tournament, not on the PGA Tour, but a national tournament, and that's the famous Golfers Magazine trophy. I never found out exactly why he won that, but the pocket watch and those medals and different things were all memorabilia that I had from my father's career in golf. And this was a full-page picture from the ad for Gleneagles Country Club. And I don't know how many of you have been around since the beginning of Gleneagles, but you had 4 PGA Tour players who helped to promote Gleneagles in the beginning. Billy Casper, Sam Snead, Doug Sanders, Bob Golby, Gay Brewer, and Doug Ford were all early promoters and residents at Gleneagles Country Club. And that's basically my presentation, but I did want to share with you, I've just written a new book, and allow me to do a little self-promotion here. It's called Summers at the Muni. I grew up in golf. My father was a golf professional. Unfortunately, he passed away when I was just 6 years old. And this is a story about growing up on a golf course, growing up around my father's friends, and how great a public golf course can be in the life and forming the life of not only myself, but other young people. And that's available at my website called buysummers.com. So I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Anybody have questions, or do I have to start again? Yeah, I seem to always ask the questions because I'm just always trying to sell.
You're a good questioner.
Yeah, I am a good questioner. All right. So, but if anybody needs to interrupt me, if the Lanters, do you have a question? Mr. and Mrs. Lanter, do you have a question? You just unmute here. I'll ask for you to unmute. Okay, there you go.
Were any of the golf professionals that promoted, and I know some lived here, given their home for free?
I can't answer that question for you. I would guess some of them probably were, but I don't know how big their homes were at the time.
They're not any bigger today.
Yeah. So tell me about these putting greens that were sand, and how long did it take? Was it ever a concept that they wanted to be grass, but because it was Florida, sand was the way to go? Or it just seemed really odd, to see such a little green, and then how much longer did it, like who was the pioneer behind getting rid of the sand and coming up with the grass?
Well, a good question, Tammy. In 1916, when they built the new Biltmore Golf Course, they hired Donald Ross. And Donald
Really?
Ross was responsible for taking those greens and turning them into grass. Before that time, it was very difficult to grow grass in Florida. And even until the last 30 or 40 years, only Bermuda grass would grow in Florida. And that had to be a very special strain of grass. And it had to be cut much taller than, say, the bent grass that people are used to up in the thing. So sand greens, sometimes they would even oil. They'd take oil and mix it with the sand to make it a firmer surface. And then the very early greens were actually the crushed seashells.
Coquina.
Yeah.
Coquina,
Yep.
right?
And the ball would bounce along the way. But those little tiny sand greens is the way golf started in Florida.
That's a trip. It was interesting to see the boy raking the grass like they do at the ballparks. So who was first? Was the ballparks with the raking their sand? Did that have any
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good parallel.
Who stole what idea?
I have a question. Did you play at Gleneagles with any of our early dignitaries when they were here?
No, I didn't. And I'll tell you, Tammy alluded to it earlier. I was contacted by this advertising agency in Fort Lauderdale, and they said, we're going to open a sales center. And could you loan us any golf clubs, any golf books, any kinds of memorabilia? So I was cautious, but I loaned them a set of Bobby Jones hickory shafted golf clubs. And I loaned them some golf books. I loaned them a book that was signed by Sam Snead because he was going to be one of the people. And I gave him a few other things. I made a list up and I totaled it up, and I thought the value was maybe $200 or $300 at the time. Well, since then, I found out that the set of golf clubs I loaned to him, which was a set of hickory shafted Bobby Jones irons, is worth about $3,000 to $5,000. And I never got it back. And I called one day and they said, oh, well, we've already returned those to the owners. And I said, well, no, you didn't. And there apparently was another person who also loaned them some things so that they had an exhibit in that early sales center. And they must have thought he
set back to give to the wrong
must have
person.
thought
They're
he
worth much.
must have owned them. And I've never saw him again. So if a set of hickory shafted golf clubs pop up in your clubhouse anywhere, let me know, please.
Did you look on eBay?
That's funny.
When Tammy called me and asked me if I would do a presentation, it was fun to think back. And I went through, I have a lot of golf memorabilia that I've saved over the years, but it was fun to go back and I can hold it up here. This is the sales pamphlet that I took those pictures from. So I saved that, even though I didn't get my golf clubs back. I still have the sales pamphlet. There's one of the pages I showed you.
I bet we have a copy somewhere. I'm sure in our archives, but I'll have to go look for it. Maybe I'll see a note about where your clubs went to.
Are there any other questions?
Is there anything that's like from your growing up, your whole life? I mean, like, were you a caddy, I guess? Were you a caddy at a Muni? And like, just through your eyes, seeing what has happened with all the golf courses, does it surprise you? Have you ever imagined that golf could be this technical with the building of the greens and the boxes? I mean, growing up, were you familiar with everything that was going on? Were you amazed with it? Because you were studying it right in front of your eyes. It just like, just wondering what your thoughts were from growing up to now.
If I can give you a short story, in 1899, My grandfather immigrated from Prussia in 1882 to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and he was a factory worker. In the late 1880s, he bought a property, and 12 years later, in 1899, they built a golf course in his backyard. And it was a private golf course, one of the first golf courses in Wisconsin. In 1907, my father was 9 years old, and he became a caddy. He followed his three older brothers as caddies, and his younger brother became a caddy after him. So my dad started caddying in 1907. He became a golf professional in 1921. So our family's been in golf for at least 115 years. So I have the family history, and this golf course was in my backyard as I grew up as a child. So it's hard to believe what golf has become. Private golf courses, even in the 1950s, 80% of all golf courses in the United States were private in the 1940s and early 1950s. Today, it's switched. 80% of the golf courses are resorts, municipal, or open to the public golf courses. And only about 20% of the golf courses remaining today are private. So that's one major change in golf, how it became much more of a non-membership concept. But golf course construction, the golf course I grew up on, the golf course that my father designed in the 1920s and 1930s, was only 5,600 yards long. Today, golf courses are 7,000, 7,500. Some golf courses are getting close to 8,000 yards long. And that's all because the equipment changed. Again, when my father was a golf professional, he built hickory golf clubs and hickory woods. Today, it's all this science. And science is what is allowing the tour players to hit the golf ball so far. 300-yard drives is normal today. So no, I don't think anybody could have foreseen or expected the changes. But for your members, Tammy, those of you who are listening, golf hasn't changed that much for you or for me. It's really the ultra elite players with their conditioning and the science of fitting clubs specifically to their swings that has changed the game so much, but it's at an elite level. So some of the things have remained the same, but at the premier levels, it's very different.
Makes total sense. Well, all right, everybody. I can only see a handful of you on video. So if anybody is not showing your video, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself. But if not, I think we are good to go. We can thank Mr. Dettlaff. And, you know, we're all applauding, but I'll do double applause. Yes, thank you. And so what are the other topics that we were thinking about having you come back for?
Well, what I call my big book, Tammy, is called Doctors of the Game. And that's the 696-page book. That's the complete history of the game of golf. And I do lectures on that. I can do a lecture anywhere from 45 minutes to 4.5 hours. I've given lectures at the British Golf Museum for the R&A in St. Andrews, Scotland, and in Edinburgh, Scotland. I've done about a dozen lectures in Scotland over the years. And so I can cater that, but the big book is best if it's viewed in a series of lectures. And I have a 3-part series where the first part is the early foundations of golf up until the 1890s. And then part 2 talks about golf coming to America in the late 1880s, 1890s, up until 1916. And then the third part is the past 100 years and how golf developed in the United States and how the golf profession developed. So I do that a lot for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute.
Well, I think I love I mean, I'm a golf fanatic, and I know there's a lot of us that play golf. And so I am going to definitely go ahead and come back to you, and we'll get the feedback from everybody tonight. So I just wanted to thank you again for coming out, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, we did. Hands